Life happens, and not always the way we expect it to. Every single day, we face change, stress, and uncertainty. What if you could learn to thrive no matter what life throws your way? Resilience expert Adam Markel and his inspiring guests explore breakthrough strategies to fully embrace change and build the resilience required to become change-proof.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Change Proof Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Markel. I am in a remote location today, so those of you that might be checking me out and consume the show on YouTube, you'll see that the location has changed. And it'll be interesting given my guest today, because I've got somebody on the show who's going to be talking about, at least a little bit anyway, about being a digital nomad. And my wife and I, we decided to kind of do a little digital nomading for the next couple of months ourselves. So we're out in the desert, and I'll share more about that a little later. But the guest that I've got is truly an amazing person. She's done so many things in her life. She's a real high achiever, but she's got she's amazing insights and such a down-to-earth way of communicating that I think you're going to find her depth and her perspective on things to be really unique and very, very special. Let me tell you a little about her, and then we'll just dive right in. Dr. Carla Fowler is an MD, PhD, and an elite executive coach. For the last decade, she has been a secret weapon for scores of CEOs, entrepreneurs, and other senior leaders. Carla's unique approach combines the latest research from performance science with timeless best practices to help top performers level up and achieve their top goals. We really get into the science of performance in this conversation. You're going to love it. Sit back and enjoy my discussion with Dr. Carla Fowler. Okay, Carla, so I would imagine that you get to hear people read your bio or share an introduction of you and all that kind of thing. It's always a funny moment, I think, for us when we hear other people talk about our history, achievements, accolades, whatever you want to call them. But my question to you at the outset is really, what's something that's not a part of that bio or not a part of a standard introduction of you that you would love for people to know about you at the outset?
Yeah, great question. Well, one of the first obvious things that comes to mind is for the past 4 years, my husband and I have been digital nomading around. So we've been living in different places of the United States. And of course, I'm running my coaching practice. It's all life as usual. This isn't like vacationing lots of spots, although that's fun too. But really getting to just be in different places, see different landscapes, ecosystems, get to do the sports that are good to do in that place. I'm in Tucson, Arizona right now, and this is a total road cycle heaven. We tried the mountain biking. We hit a couple of cacti, and then we're like, oh yeah, nope, we might not be mountain bikers here, but we can ride on the roads. So that's just kind of a fun and interesting experience that often, with Zoom, we don't know where anyone is. And so, that's my experience over the past 4 years, and it's been super interesting.
Wow, I love that. And so what was the inspiration? I'm sure there's some people listening to this going, wow, digital nomad. I've heard of that, or I've thought of that, or maybe they've never, got even been acquainted with that sort of term or the idea behind it. But give us the origin story, if you could, around how you became digital nomads.
Yeah, well, this is a great story, and it's interesting, right? Like when you partner with someone for life, part of what happens is there's a merging of dreams. And I don't know that myself, I had a dream about doing lots of travel or living lots of places, but I think my husband had a little more of that bug. But one of the really interesting things, in my background, I had one almost whole, what feels like a career path of being in medicine, which with a few exceptions is a very location dependent career, right? You need to see people in person. Ultimately, about 12 years ago, pivoted into something that I started as a location-dependent thing. I started a coaching practice. I met with people in person. I did very much enjoy that. But one of the interesting things about moving into that realm was it was suddenly opening up the possibility that I might not need to be in one place all the time. And my husband was an entrepreneur. He already had sort of location freedom. And the origin is that we started to talk about it, that it would be really interesting. Like, what a wild adventure that, technology enables these days. And then so it was on our how could we get there list, and thinking about what were the steps we'd have to take. Well, then you can fast forward to like the pandemic, 2020. We were living in a high-rise building in Seattle, which was sort of one of the like ground zeros where we first had like a big cohort of patients. And we're like, this is not fun. Like we're like, quarantining, just like staying in our apartment, and we're really far from a lot of the stuff we love, like wilderness. And we also were like, this is the moment. Like, this really sucks, everything that is happening. And also, it is a time when suddenly what is normalized is a remote interaction. And so we took the opportunity when it came. And we started, I think where did we go first? We did a trial in Taos. And we said, well, let's just try it. We'll just get a short-term rental. We did a couple months, and we'll just see how we feel about it. And we did that trial. We hiked all the peaks like around, and, did our work like normal, but just found it was a total kick and an adventure and a dose of novelty. And so we came back to Seattle, packed up our apartment, sold a bunch of stuff, and we were off. We moved 14 times in 18 months in the first round.
I was just going to ask you about that. That's so funny. All right.
We went to Big Sky. We went to like the Mammoth Lakes area. Gosh, we went to Driggs, Idaho, a lot of stuff in the West, kind of mountain towny. But we definitely realized that ratio of moving to staying was a lot of packing for the benefit. So we've since we've settled down into it. So now we're like 4 or 5 or 6 months in a place, and then a move. So we actually get to kind of settle down, really experience something before we go somewhere else.
Yeah.
That's the story.
And are there other sort of benefits to your psyche from the fact that you've had to, not only be so agile, adaptable, I suppose, to these different environments, but also had to simplify, I would imagine.
Yeah.
In fact, a very similar experience that my wife and I have been on, which I'll share in a moment. But yeah, I mean, you have to simplify quite a bit to do that too, right? You can't carry around a house on your back.
No. Well, both those things are really true. You brought up like sort of the agility or the adaptiveness, because I think one of the things, and this is very related to probably some of the topics we'll touch on today, are that we can, particularly high performing people, but like we love to have control as human beings. And when we can be in one place.
Can I just interject you think?
Yeah, right.
or maybe insert a duh or something.
Yeah, totally. By the way, I'm the queen of like obvious statements. And part of that is because it actually, but it's so important. I actually relish saying
I'm just
really
like
obvious
people,
things.
When you say to people, aren't we a little bit like, control freaks, and people look at you like, no, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Not me.
No, never. But we love that sense of control. And if you are like even half good at things, then what that means is you can go through your environment and you could start optimizing things. And you could say, well, I have my, whatever my special this, or like, here's how we always do, dinner, or here's how I like to do my workout, or here's even how I like my meeting schedule, or they're just all these things that we start to optimize. And that is absolutely a piece of performance, right?
Yeah. Or this is my favorite pillow.
Yes, this is my favorite pen. Everyone listening, I am holding up a G2 Pilot like pen, right? Like, but we get things like this. My favorite notebook.
Smooth ball, like really nice, even ink flow. Yeah. And I'm a lefty, so pens mean a lot to me because most of them suck from a lefty's perspective,
Yes.
And I'll drag my hand across the page, so I always have ink on my palm or something like that. So pen, that doesn't leak all over you. Yeah.
Exactly. Like we get these preferences, and having preferences is one of the joys in life. It also can start to narrow our worlds. And so one of the really interesting experiences for me, I was like, for the past 12 years, I have been building my coaching practice. And so if you figure maybe, I guess, gosh, like 5 years ago, we like took the show on the road. Um, there were all sorts of things you have to sort. And one of the interesting things is when we're thinking about performance, we have to know and trust in ourselves about how we're going to perform when the conditions are not ideal. And I think we've all gotten like kind of a crash course in this over. I mean, I think many people would say much longer than the past 5 years, like if you include some recessions and different things, like operating in unideal conditions. And so it forced me to say, what are you going to do if the internet's patchy? You now have an entirely Zoom-based business. Like, and you might be in Driggs, Idaho, and there's a big snowstorm, and or like in Tucson, for example, we get monsoons in the summer that can knock out the power. Last summer, the power went out for like probably like 36 hours or something. And so you suddenly have to ask yourself, well, I want to perform at a high level, but also, how am I going to deal with these hiccups? Some of that is like the grace with which you approach it. Some of it is very execution, like what's your backup? And some of it is just philosophically or strategically understanding what is most important about what I'm doing and can I still deliver that, as opposed to getting so far down into the weeds of like tweaking and optimizing every little thing. And I think this is an interesting, just perhaps general commentary on how one could have an exercise in how one can create experiences in one's life that help you practice being adaptable or practice being resilient, where you don't have the control over everything. And that's sort of my story or my experience of this. Everything from, like you're like, wow, that snowplow outside's really loud. Like we don't have that in Seattle. But yeah, just.
Do you find that there's practice in the letting go of things as well? Because as I was listening to you, I was thinking, gosh, we have so many preferences. Yes, we're in many ways so attached to control, safety, in other words, to this,
Yes.
What is familiar and what is secure and what is known and all that kind of thing. And then you go through a pandemic and we realize, there's so much that we lack any control over, of course, as though that's, there should be another one, insert duh right here. It's like, because these things are so obvious. And yet when you look at the way we live, like look at other people as you and I both do in on the research side and working with, like we spend a lot of time working with leaders and teams in organizations. So we get kind of embedded in there to look at how people behave and what their habits are and whatnot. And so, so we absolutely lean into control, but we also are very attached to our preferences. As you say, my favorite pen, I said my favorite pillow, or, the quiet or the lack of the quiet, like any number of things. So this digital nomadic existence, has it helped you to let go of some of those preferences, that sort of the weight of all of that stuff that we want to kind of take with us, mentally, not just the physical stuff, but the mental stuff as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually, it's been sort of two things. So, or actually, let's say maybe three things. And this is great because this we are getting into like how I think about performance science, which is, so I run a coaching practice. We really focus on performance science as a way or a methodology or a framework for like how do you approach the challenges you're facing in your work or in your life? What are ways to like think about it where it's not just like I have to do better or somehow work harder, which often isn't super useful. And but often when I'm thinking about how, and we can talk more formally about how I break this down, but there are often different buckets we can go to say, what's a way I could approach this challenge? So you just brought up the challenge of like, okay, I'm moving all over the place. Things don't always work the way I think they will. I might be about to log on with someone who, you want to do a great job for, and you're like, oh man, like not like the internet is super patchy. So how do you deal with that? And you brought up this point of like letting go. And I think that is one of the pieces of like what are mindsets we can have. So one bucket of performance really is about like what is our psychology about it? What are some mindsets that help us like kind of have the grace to roll with the punches, for example. But another way to think about it, so flip away from letting it go. And another bucket that I think a lot about with performance is you could say it's what are we focused on or what is our strategy? And simply put, a lot of strategy is just saying, have you clearly defined what you're aiming at? And do you actually know like what's important that you're going to focus your resources towards? This can be money, this can be time, attention, like where your team is focused. But that in a nutshell is what is strategy. And it is like, what are all the stuff you're not going to do? Or what are all those things? Because there will be way more of those. So one way you could think about this experience of having to be resilient, of not having things all set up the way you want, is it helps you start to think about, well, what was actually most important for the coaching experience, right? Like, so if I want to have impact and help a really great leader who is dealing with some challenges, what is actually most important? And yes, I should have a great online experience for that. You know, I should like, there are lots of things one builds to optimize a practice. And yet, if you simplified it and said, but what is the core of how like we could have a dialogue that is of value to them? And it's like, well, a phone will do that. You know, you can do that on the phone. And so some of this was also focusing, getting back to the core of what matters most. And you might layer on some extra when you have the option of doing that. But in performance, it's often really important for us to define like, do we know the core of what matters most? Because our time is limited and our time and our bandwidth and even like how many like we'll keep this clean. Like, how much anxious cycles do I have to worry about X, Y, or Z? Like, do I have that energy to give, right, to something? And also to say, you might not. And that might be okay because it might not be related to what's most important for what you're trying to do. So that's a different way to think about it. There's letting go, and there was definitely some of that, but there's also a refocusing on, well, actually, what mattered most, and am I able to deliver that? And then I think the last piece, this is another bucket of performance, is really around practices and execution, like building capabilities. And so part of adaptability and resilience is, hey, do you know how to sort of manage the awkward moment when something doesn't go to plan? Are you practiced at that? Do you sort of have some backup plans of like, well, here's what we're going to do instead, or this would be like a learning moment for us, or you know, that's another piece of that resiliency. And so I learned like, oh, how do you reconnect to your backup hotspot? How do you, get on the phone real quick and you have everyone's phone number. So you switch seamlessly to a different experience. Like some of these are just really practical execution pieces that also help us be resilient. And so like, I love this as a microcosm because we've gotten through 3 of the buckets that I think about with performance. There is one more and we can get to that. But I think this is why it was such a powerful exercise for me.
Yeah. And I'm feeling it as well when I'm listening to you speak about it, because I think about, we like to say that you practice resilience before you need it. You develop resilience before you need it. So it's, and sometimes even in the book Change Proof, I talk about the idea of performing resilience. You perform it before it's needed. And it's, as you say, because it allows you to operate in the world as it actually is. Now we have the world in our heads and then there's the world in reality. And sometimes they're similar, but I mean, often the world is really a lot less perfect, a lot less ordered, a lot less neat and clean than the world in our, inside of our sometimes well organized, well intentioned, very goal oriented minds. And so, if every time sort of something is, not sort of optimal in the environment, it's sort of it can easily distract you at a minimum. It can throw a lot of people off. It can really get in the way of performance, I would think, but I know this is your real expertise. So yeah, I'd love to go back before we get to that fourth one and share a little bit of the backstory on how it is that you became so more than just infatuated with performance and how it is and why it is that you actually work with people that way, coaching them, et cetera. So.
Well, I'm so glad you asked because, again, sometimes they're just stories that aren't really clear when you try to connect the dots on paper. And, I will often get asked, like, how did you start in like a career in academic medicine? Like you got an MD, you got a PhD, then big pivot, like out of your residency program into starting a coaching practice that was focused around performance science. And so, yeah, it's like, how connect those dots. So if we go back really far, and I'm talking like fifth grade. This is the first time I can remember having a thought that I would categorize as like, well, that was sort of a performance-based thought. Like I was in fifth grade is the first time I can remember asking a question of like, well, I want X, Y, or Z, and I see other people getting X, Y, or Z, and I would like to understand why that is. Like in its simplest form, it could be like, well, there's a track meet, and I'd like to perform well at that track meet. But it also bled into other realms, right? Like there were questions about, hey, you start to see the social structures getting set up in middle school, right? Who's friends with who? Like, where is the influence? And of course, this plays out every day in the politics of our workplaces. So this is not about just, middle school social dynamics. This is a fundamental thing about us as human beings. But like, I was really curious and wondering about these things. And at some point, probably around middle school, I figured out that one of the best ways that I could learn was sort of to subject myself, to put myself into arenas or situations in which I would be forced to be challenged and I would have to figure it out. And it would create enough pressure of the scenario that, I'd be really motivated. We can argue whether that was like a clean, like intrinsic motivation or if it was more fear, but regardless, it was effective. And so, fast forward a little bit, as you're growing up, there are lots of arenas in which one can be challenged. You've got, academics, where do you go to college? Where are you going to study? There was definitely sports for me. I was a runner, so ran like cross country and track. Headed off to college, was like, I want to keep playing sports, but I don't think I can run here. So walked onto the crew team. And Brown, which was my college, has a nationally ranked crew team, but they took walk-ons. So it was like, great, you want to start at zero and row with people who have been rowing already for probably at least 4 years. That I was so excited. This was like this is a chance of a lifetime. When can you like just join something like this? And
I'm literally smiling ear to ear, and I'm only going to interrupt your flow for 1 second to say, because this is one of those uncanny things, okay? Because I got to walk on a crew team as well. I was a swimmer and played water polo in college, but when I got to this experience was when I went to England and I got to study at the University of York, and they had this well-regarded crew team and this beautiful river, the River Ouse that's there, et cetera, and I don't even know how it happened, but I went out for that walk-on, crew team, and I want to know what your experience was like. It was one of the best things I've ever done in my entire life, and one of the most difficult, challenging physically, but also on a lot of psychological levels as well. But how funny that you and I had that same experience.
I'm so glad you interrupted.
Uncanny, actually. Yeah. Too funny.
Well, I think for me, it encapsulates a characteristic of experiences I really appreciate, which is where you show up and it isn't entirely based on like, where precisely have you been before? What precise experiences have you had? But is much more about what capabilities do you have? And I think like whenever I'm coaching someone who is transitioning, like this question comes up a lot because like in work or in careers, sometimes like we may want to make a pivot. We may want to do something different, but that doesn't mean we're starting at zero. And so in this crew experience, what I loved was they wanted walk-ons. Like they absolutely had recruited athletes who would go on to the Olympics and did, but they needed to fill boats, and they understood that they could teach athletic, like really hardworking people. And see, this is a great, I think, your experience. You obviously were athletic. I'm assuming hardworking, given your background. And like, they were like, we can actually teach you how to row very well. And in some ways, we'd love to get to be the ones to teach you so that you don't develop a bunch of bad habits. And like, and we welcome you because we see like they never said this out loud. Of course, it was all coachy stuff, like get in the locker room, do this, do this, do this. But there was a value you knew because they welcomed you and they took the time to teach you and really started at the basics. Like a crew stroke, like can be broken down into like about 4 parts. And they literally started part by part. And I'm guessing you might echo this, but being in a sweep 8, going full speed, like in flow, there's nothing like it. And I mean, I think people got a little bit of that when like the Boys in the Boat book came out, when the movie came out, I think to try and encapsulate it. But like, and I haven't rowed since college, but like, this is such a unique experience. And not just the rowing part of it, but the, hey, how do you show up for stuff with all your capabilities and learn to do a new thing that you actually don't have
exactly like
the resume for?
We're so
Right.
adaptable, but we're also, there's this, we have far greater capacity, I think, than most people give themselves credit for. And especially as you say, like in that work context where people think, I've got so much invested in this one area, it's sort of that sunk cost fallacy.
Yes.
They've sunk so much time into something that it would be foolish from a career standpoint or a development standpoint, I don't want to start at the beginning. I don't want to suck at something again, you really do. I mean, I would say, I don't know how that experience, the rowing experience was for you at the beginning. I know for me, it was challenging in the sense that my hands were so soft. Like I was a swimmer. I played water polo.
Oh, they get totally like torn up.
They're wrecked.
Oh yeah, totally wrecked.
And to the point where
that's pretty normal.
The blisters are so intense that you could barely hold on to the oar. It's stuff like that. And then you've got to feather that oar and be in sync. And,
yep.
I mean, so in the end, it works out. I mean, in my experience, it was just ridiculous. It was so amazing, and we did well, and all that kind of thing. But it was the willingness to suck for some period of time that I think is really, I don't know that we are that adept at accepting that in us, or like dealing with that emotion as we can be, because otherwise, if I wasn't, if you don't have that humility to really just be a neophyte at something, and like you say, have to be taught really from the start, like how do you hold the thing? I mean, the basics, right? Then you won't, you won't allow yourself that opportunity to go, wow, I would never have known I could do this. And like, I didn't make a career out of it, but it became one of the best experiences of my college life. And I still talk about it. You and I are talking about it. So you go, but without that willingness to, that sort of, I use the word humility. I don't know do you have a better word for that? What's that mindset in a performer, in someone that you're looking to help to perform better? Are they actually in their own way because they lack that humility at times? What's been your experience with that?
I mean, we can all, it's well said, because I think we can all get in our own way, like when that is kind of rising up within us. And interestingly, I think this relates to resiliency quite a bit, and like how we deal with uncertainty, because I think one of the things uncertainty often puts in front of us is it highlights a gap between what we think might be necessary and where we feel like we are. So it kind of highlights a learning gap. And so often when we're learning something, we're at 0, or at least we are not where we need to be. And I think this comes into performance at all. So I've accomplished a lot, but like not without things coming that are challenging, or places where, I've failed, or I'm like, oh yeah, I didn't do that great at that, whether you want to call it failure or not. But like, for example, using the career example, I I had a very like bright start in that. Like I learned quick. I was tall but smaller, and so competed in some like erging, like lightweight competitions, did very well. And but like got so caught up in my own head about wanting to do well that like a year or two in was like my form got like I had really great form when I started, and my form got all off. And the whole point was because I was trying to control it so much that like I was gripping the oar too hard. And like this was the challenge I dealt with at the end of that experience. And it still was this amazing experience, but it taught me that like what are some of the ways we as high performers get in our own way. And I like the image of like you're gripping too hard. And you could use this as a analogy for trying to control things too much, creating a lot of friction for yourself as you're like optimizing down to the nth degree versus like what we referenced before, saying, do I understand the core of what's most important here? And can I deal with a little bit of mess? Or as other people have put it, like having some fires that continue to burn, like where I'm not going to, everything's not going to be sorted perfectly all the time. But if I have a sense of what's really important and what we need to be invested in, that we can keep going and be quite successful. And so that was something I learned from that career experience. And I actually think I took it into medical school like fairly well, which is to say there were a lot of things I wanted during this like 10-year period where I was getting a PhD and an MD. And it was sort of like a job. So it was a scholarship program that because I was going to do a PhD also, and that's a whole nother, half decade of your life, they would pay for everything. So you got not a big salary, but like a grad student salary, and you had no loans. And I was like, this is incredible. And it's sort of furthering my dream of like wanting to be in a field where I felt like I was really helping people, like where I could connect that my work to like an impact to someone. And while I was in medical school, actually, I did an analysis, and this is a place where, I mean, you could just spend all of your waking hours studying every last detail. But I kind of looked at the whole thing and said, I need to get good enough grades. I mean, I need to pass this test, but there's a lot of other stuff I want in life. And so I learn best by reading. I don't learn that well in class. And so I made trade-offs. I was not your ideal med student. In grades wise, did great, but like I'm not a model. But I like skipped class, and I did a number of other challenging things like while I was in the program. So I took up a new sport. I took up ultimate frisbee and played it at an elite level, like went to national championships, won a world championship, and had to embrace, instead of saying, how do I like control everything, tried to embrace, how do I make sure I do what's important in each of these like channels or buckets of my life so that I can have the life that I want, but also be an ambitious person. And this kind of goes back to this thought we had about performance, which is what resiliency is there to be had, or like what performance comes from being really clear on where you're getting most your impact from, and then being able to say, all right, this is not going to be optimal. It's probably not going to look optimal, but I might actually be able to have a lot of the impacts I want, even a bigger impact than if I'm trying to optimize everything from like to the smallest degree. And so that was a really interesting follow-on experience to undergrad, which was to say, how do I focus on what's most matters? And it's going to be a little messy, but still kind of emerge with what I'm interested in. And so just in contrast.
Yeah, I love that. And I had a question that I wanted to insert here too for our folks that are listening to this right now, watching potentially as well. And I wrote it down. What are you holding on to, or what are you holding too tightly? I think that's a valuable question for all of us to ask that. But back to the story about holding on to the oar and the gripping piece of it. Because as you said, it's a great analogy. And so I feel like there's probably some value that anybody listening to this right now could get in simply answering that question for themselves, whether it's in this moment or to, sort of sit with that, come back to it, noodle on it for a while, take a walk, make some time to meditate on that. What am I holding on too tightly to, potentially, because it's interesting because I think a big part of how we move through situations and develop that resiliency in mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually speaking is through energy. It's through managing our energy, right? Which is a big word. But I think for a lot of people, energy could be substituted. You could substitute that word for willpower. And I think when you're talking about gripping something too tightly like that oar and you're sort of wanting to control that situation to the point where it's kind of messed up your form.
Yeah.
Was really that sort of result of exercising that willpower.
Yeah.
And I think in certain activities in life, if you want to put a nail through a board, then some willpower is going to work well. Because the harder you hit that nail with that hammer or whatever it is, the faster it's going to go through the board. But in a lot of other areas in life, especially the ones that are mental or things that involve creativity or are much more nuanced, let's say, willpower can really can be the not the right energy to meet the moment when it comes to performing. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. And I often find with performance that we're not looking at the extremes. There are cases where we are looking at the extreme, but like the idea of like, well, I just need to, max out my willpower to achieve what I want to achieve. As you said, like, has challenges. I just gave a great example of like what, what happened for me and crew. And yet it's a tool. And so sometimes there's this thing that I think is a useful saying that things can be tools, not identities. And what it means is when we can do that. So a great example is some people may really have as a piece of their identity, like, I am a willpower machine. I will do it. I am going to show up day in and day out. And that is like, it is a useful skill set. But if one has it as an identity, and I'll use a personal example because I think this is really important. Like, but I've coached countless people who have come up against this in their own lives. And like, what happens when you decide you like don't want to do that thing anymore? Like, it's the same with like, I'm not a quitter. Right? This idea of identity around whether or not you see something all the way through, whatever that means, right? However you've defined that. So for an example, let's fast forward. I finished med school. I finished my PhD. I'm a general surgery resident at Stanford. And I loved surgery. It was like very high performing, very challenging residency program. And like, I loved all those things about it. I loved that it has a physical and like a mental decision-making piece of it. And like, I got there and, it was my first choice. So I'm like top of the world. And I get there and like by about like 4 months in, I'm just like, I am like miserable. And there are a variety of reasons for this, but I'm like, this is not like, I can't really see how I'm fitting this into my future, like going forwards year after year after year. And I'm looking at the attendings and I'm like, I don't know that I want the life that they have. And that's not a judgment on them. It's just like, we all have to make our own personal decisions about this, but like, and so you can imagine like, and I'm a person who has often like gritted stuff out. I have a ton of willpower and self-discipline. And you reach this kind of moment and it can be really difficult. Like, all right, so you've committed to this thing. Does that mean you need to see it through for the next 40 years? Or is willpower a tool for you? And but is there room for you to make a change? Is there room for you to say, well, I imagine this would be different and I probably could have done more research on that point, but also I got to try it. I've proved to myself I could do it, but I don't know if I want to. Where is the room for me to say, you could willpower your way through this, but what if like, what are you missing out on? Like, what is the cost of that? If you start to multiply that over the years of what you could be doing differently.
The cost benefit analysis, I think, just does make so much sense in that moment to be asking that. And well, finish your point because I want to come back to something you said earlier that I wrote down. So I want to come back to that. So
one of the nice things is, and this was a thought, like this analysis of it occurred later, this summary of it, but like, if one can say, yeah, I have a lot of willpower. That's a tool I have, and I can use it when I need it. And I did use that tool. I finished the whole year. I let them know with some advance notice I wouldn't return for a second year. But I finished the year, and that took tons of willpower. So it's a tool. And I think if we can start to say willpower is a tool, but it doesn't have to be my identity. I can pull it out of the kit when I need it. But there are other moments where more willpower isn't the solution, where, for example, what might be the solution is you need to express some creativity and vision in defining, well, if I were not a surgeon, what would I do? And I had to do that as well, to say, how would I take all of these like skills I've been trained with and turn it into something that I actually can imagine doing for 40 more years?
Yeah.
Like that's another tool, right? Always being in the visioning or the creativity space. Like I think that's an identity for some people as well. And yet sometimes we need to be not in that space and we need to be executing. So I like this idea of freeing ourselves up to be more than one thing, to not get too stuck in an identity, but instead to say like, I can have a lot of tools, pieces of myself that I can access. And then I can pick and select, like, is a hammer the right tool for this? Do we need to pound a nail right now? Okay, great. A hammer's a great thing for that. But, if I need to maybe we need to cut a board. Okay, well, hammer's not a great tool for that. So, but now I really want to hear what you were thinking, and we can go from there.
No, I so love where you're going with that. I mean, I wrote down the question, if not willpower, then what? Because where I was thinking before was just that because people lean on that. They
absolutely,
to use your analogy, that's a tool that they go back to again and again. So yeah, a screwdriver would be a better tool here, but we'll still pick up the hammer because it's like, if I can't screw that thing in, I'll just bang it in, like somehow, some way I'm gonna use that tool for that. And I think that, ultimately when we think about what gets in the way of resiliency and how it is that people do end up burned out, which you and I probably see quite a bit of in our work. You go, well, how did that happen? When people are so resourceful and they have all these capabilities and they have all these tools that are, theoretically speaking, available to them, and yet they keep picking up the hammer, to use your point. And then ultimately that becomes depleting for a variety of reasons, including the fact that it's ineffective. And you could swing that hammer a whole heck of a lot more times and get worn out doing it than it would be to pick up a different tool that would allow you to more elegantly create what you're looking for. But it's less of a sort of an outer game and more of an inner game is really where I was going, and wanted to get a sense from you. So, in many ways, willpower is a physical thing to me. I know it's not it's literally not that, doesn't have to be defined as physical. And yet I think a lot of that energy, when people define it, when they're looking for it and they're wanting to deploy it, it's sort of a physical look. I'm tired, but I'll muscle through. I'll sleep when I die, or I'll sleep over the weekend and I'll just do without for now, or I don't need to actually focus on the better choice for myself from a food intake standpoint, or hydrate myself because I just need to muscle through this now. And I think a lot of people do that.
The language that we use around willpower is very physical. And I think I always say words have power, right? And you can often listen to how someone talks about something, or how you are talking, you yourself, right? Like are talking about something, and get some clues around like, how am I really thinking about that thing? But I love it. You're like, we got to muscle it out. Like we got to grit it out. Like,
so what I want to understand from your standpoint, if it's not willpower, then what is it? And if it's not a physical sort of muscling through something, like, enduring it, that endurance of I'm not going to quit in the middle of the year. I'm going to finish this year, no matter what it takes. I will get to that point where I've completed at least that much, and now I'll move on. If it's not that, then on the mental side or on the emotional side, how is it that we can, or from a performance standpoint, how would you coach someone or help them to perform at a higher level without actually trying harder?
yes, great question. And this is where I love performance science because it actually gives us different options for how to tackle this. And what's great is you can actually talk these through with another person. It's not just me and my coaching performance science operating system, like making a judgment. Although sometimes I have an inkling like of, I suspect given what I've heard, like this might be the root. But this is where I love thinking through like these 4 buckets of performance. And we can start to say like, what's going to be helpful here? And so, for example, if someone is like, I am so burned out, I'm like leaning fully on willpower and I'm trying to find a way out of this. Some of the questions I might ask are number 1, sometimes someone just has way too much work to do. Like they are literally trying to do it all. And this is the mistake that's happening when in fact, they might actually be able to reach some of their goals, but they're not going to do everything they see everyone else doing. And what we need to do is focus them. So one route in is that first bucket of performance. It's like, could we look at what really is giving you impact and start to say, rather than trying to muscle through doing it all, can we actually make your portfolio of activities more potent, your time usage more potent? And so like, that is one of the things we can look at is literally making some changes in how time is being used. The second bucket is like often around execution. It's both about like, what are sort of your capabilities and processes and systems? And so sometimes we want to look at what people are doing. Like this is particularly true in like business leadership to sort of say, is there work on your business that might be useful or with your team? Like, is part of this that you're reinventing the wheel all the time as opposed to having some like repeatable processes? Or are you trying to do everything, but you actually have this whole team who could really help you if you could kind of let go, like delegate some things? So like that's a route through the second bucket, which is sort of this execution. How are we actually sort of operating the things we thought were most important? Then I think the third piece that we've talked a little bit about is just like the mindset piece, right? And this is getting a little more at like, okay, if someone's like, I'm just used to pulling out the hammer, we can talk a little bit about like, well, what feels good about the hammer, right? Like, and kind of dig in a little bit to like, what might be some like ongoing beliefs that one has about why a hammer is a good thing to do. Sometimes it comes from our childhood, right? Like, my family was very much a family where we were trained to like be responsible. Like, in fact, don't just be responsible for yourself, but be responsible for the stuff that goes wrong for other people as well. And like, you're smiling, Adam, and it's because you can totally see how this goes wrong when you put it into a workplace. For example, we can explore that mindset, or even the thought of like, my team is working so hard. I feel like if I'm not in the trenches right there with them, as opposed to like, no, your team needs you to be thinking like strategically preparing for the future. And also don't take away their wins, right? Like we could create a whole new mindset that isn't that, for example, one needs to be responsible and in the trenches all the time, but instead say, no, like as a leader, your role might be really different. So create a new mindset about what's the value you're bringing that doesn't require you picking up the hammer. So that's kind of like that mindset bucket. And there's a fourth bucket that we didn't talk about. So let's just introduce the fourth bucket. And that is physiology. So at a base level, everything that's happening in our brains and in our bodies, it's a bunch of chemicals. Like we are bags of chemicals. And we will save the debate for what else is there for other folks. But we have to care for like the bag of chemicals. And we know there are great things we can be doing that really shift whether or not we're in fight or flight all the time. Basically like where we're sitting in terms of, are we kind of relaxed and calm, or are we like out of our gourds stressed? And stress is a fine thing to have. Stress is not bad for us. In fact, I love what the author Kelly McGonigal said about stress, which is stress tells us that there's something that we care about that is at stake. And it is good for us to have things we care about in our lives. So stress, if you have something you care about in your life, you will have stress because that's how it works. But I think one of the things we can think about is when we're feeling burnt out, we're trying to go back to that like willpower hammer, is to sort of say, well, where is sort of my physiology at? And do I need to be caring and investing both long term and short in the moment things to kind of ramp myself down so that it's okay to be stressed? We just don't want to be chronically stressed all the time. And also, we want to know that like it's okay to have some stress. That's and in when there's uncertainty, there will always be some stress with that, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. And so the way you might explore that bucket is looking at practices like exercise or getting enough sleep or diet, or have you had a hug recently, right? Like if you had time with people you care about, meditation, or even just kind of mindfulness and breathing practices. So there are a lot of things that just care for like ourselves as a literally like as a physiological being. And that is the fourth bucket that matters and impacts all the other buckets. So these are ways I think about, and again, you can kind of look to see where people are leaning in, and you can also look where there's the biggest opportunity to impact them. But it gives us a lot of options, and that's as a coach, I love saying, all right, if that didn't work, we have many more options. Like we will keep trying things.
I love it. So, Carla, just as we wrap things up, I would love for you to summarize those four buckets once again, because we've done them over the course of the last, 30-ish minutes. So, would you do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you.
Four buckets. The first one is like focus or strategy. What's most important and what are you aiming at? Second bucket is really about execution. So the things you've decided are important, what are the best ways to do those things or to help your team kind of organize to do those things? Third bucket is like mindset and psychology. So this is everything from how do you keep yourself motivated to how to motivate your team? What makes you feel confident and not? How are you thinking about things? And then the fourth bucket is really that physiology, that baseline, just the hormones and chemicals that are meant to help us rise to the challenge, but that also we have to make sure they have time to sort of ramp down as well. And so practices to help with that.
Just on the physiology side, I'd love to get a sense of what do you have some favorite rituals? Everybody has their own individual ones. We talk a lot about the rituals, not only on the show, but in our work as well, because it really, in many ways, I think as you said, it impacts everything else. The ripple effect of whether you're a bit sleep deprived or a little hangry or any of the other ways that sort of our physiology intersects with, everything else that's going on in our world.
Yes,
is a lot more prevalent than I think we might even say all the time. So, just curious, you have some favorite practices?
Absolutely, and I'm definitely like kind of a planner and like have some habits. But this is going back to digital nomading. When we move places, it's a wonderful moment to like rethink a habit and say, is this still a habit I want? Do I need to change it? So that's. Sorry, total tangent, but it's something I forgot to mention at the start, which is it's good to have habits, but sometimes our habits need to evolve. And so that's an interesting role that moving locations sometimes plays. But my favorite habits are, number one, I love exercising outside. And I do some weightlifting in a gym as well, but like most of the days of the week, I want to be like biking or walking or rucking or running outside. And I do that in the morning when possible, because I mean, the science would show that you get endorphin burst from that goes throughout your day. But for me, it's more important. Like I just feel happy when I do it. So that's how I feel. I sleep a lot. Like I sleep like 8 or 9 hours a night. And I don't know if I know that some people get by on less, and I just, it just helps my brain rewire and process a lot of the learning, or just, I think it gives me really good capacity to be really present with people all day. And so sleep's a really important one for me. And then I think a third one is, I think one of the like greatest joys in my life is like time to talk with my husband. And so we have kind of planned times. We sort of know like when that's happening every week, at what time of the day, like, or what's the activity we're doing together? Are we going for a hike on Saturday and we'll have 4 hours to just like geek out on whatever we want to talk about? But but I think those are three things that are really important to me. And if one looked at my calendar, you'd be like, Oh, like someone would be able to deduce that probably from looking at my calendar.
Yes,
So,
for me as well. In the sense that if it's important to me, it's on my calendar these days. Whereas in the past years, 20 years ago or so, my calendar wasn't a reflection of what was important to me, and what I've learned. And maybe this is wisdom. I don't know, just experience or something. But things that are calendared happen typically in my
yeah.
life, and things that aren't calendared don't typically happen. So those walks, the time that you spend in for us in resilience language, we call it recovery periods.
Yeah.
So toggling the alternation, that interval training from my swimming days back and forth between sort of your exertion stage and your rest and recovery stage. The alternation between those two things is what leads to growth in
Yep.
so many respects. So you've got to schedule that. And I
We
think
do.
when we work often with leaders, we're helping them to understand that even though they've got tremendous pressure on them always to perform, that the way for them to be more effective leaders is not to drive their teams harder and harder to perform better. Ultimately, it's to help them to recognize this value in that alternation between phases and stages of exertion,
Yeah.
and those same ritualized recovery periods, because that's ultimately when greater innovation, ingenuity, problem solving, critical thinking, and performance, and that old just sort of those things are bolstered when we're at better, and when we're depleted, and when we're
Absolutely.
burned out, which is what we're hearing a lot about today, for a good reason. Anxiety levels are levels that people psychologists, psychiatrists have never seen before. You go, something's not right, something's off. So I want to just love to get your last word on this. So given that is the landscape that we're hearing a lot about,
Yeah.
what do you have a sort of a best recommendation for, you're brought into an organization and they have engagement challenges, or they have turnover, or you've heard that anxiety is on the rise there. Burnout is a word that's being used. What's your philosophy, or where, and this is too broad perhaps a question, but I mean, if you're going to look at something, if you're going to focus on or target something with a senior level leader, in, given that context, what's your sort of your method?
What's my go-to? How do I approach that?
A little bit. Yeah, I know that's really broad. So, but maybe
No,
just
that's
a piece.
okay.
Yeah.
You are allowed to ask those questions. So one of the first things that I would really think about is, and you sort of got to work through a stepwise process, but I'm going to tell you the first thing I start with is it comes back to that first bucket of performance, which is, I think it's really important to have clarity as a leader of what are we trying to do? And that of course waterfalls down to the leaders under you, but I think one of the most stressful things for a team or company can be, we don't know, we want we're at work, we're being evaluated, and also as human beings, we like to contribute, we like to win. And so if it's not clear what we're trying to accomplish as a company and what we think are the most important priorities for that, which then has to be translated down through teams and different roles, what's their part of it. But that is one of the first things that I think is important to get clarity on, because a lot of anxiety can come from, certainly if there's a totally toxic culture, that's a whole nother bag of worms. But let's just say there are many workplaces that are not toxic, but there might not be clarity, and that can create all sorts of stress and anxiety about on the individual level about, how do I help my team win today? What will be valued if I contribute it? If I'm going to learn or grow, what would be the directions to learn and grow in so I can contribute more and be recognized and seen for that? There's a number of root causes that come from this focus, and strategy bucket of can you be clear to everyone about, hey, here's where we're aiming. Here's what we think is most important. And here's how we think we could win at that. And then to have leaders start to say, what does that mean for my team? And how do I help my team members know their part, how they're contributing, so that I can both recognize them for it, and so we can figure out how to do that well together as a team. This is a dramatic oversimplification.
I love it though.
Obviously,
Yeah.
you have to work through then some other things like, okay, well, people have to execute, and you do have to think about culture and how are people interacting together? What's the general vibe of a place? But I think you can have a great culture, but if people don't know how to win, you will have other issues. There will be an anxiety, even though everyone's nice to each other and like respectful and it's not toxic. So,
and I loved what you said earlier. So I would go back, if I were answering that question, I would go back to something you said earlier too, which is that choosing the right tool. We had a good kind of in-depth discussion around the hammer. So knowing the tools that your team is using, meaning the tools that you're giving them or that you're suggesting, but also what's their default? Because as you say, their identity is so tied up in some of that stuff. Then it comes back to childhood. It goes back to so many other influences in their lives that it could be just that the fact is they're using the wrong tool. But if you're not paying attention because you're yourself so in the weeds as a leader, everybody's rowing so hard that nobody, that you're not in that position to be the coxswain or right. I mean, so back to our rowing days, that person's the person who sits on the end of the boat and is looking at
and yells at everybody
and is yelling at everybody. True, but often just to keep the cadence right, to get everybody kind of in a flow. But without that objective look at how people are using the tools, you could be missing a lot. And the converse being true, that you could find a lot, you could learn a lot, you could really be able to help your team in a great deal more ways by just thinking about it the way you suggested, which is that, are we using the right tool? And also it can be a tool and not be an identity. Like, so where is it possible to step outside of that default? Carla, I could talk to you all day. I loved it. I love the conversation. I so appreciate your time today. You were amazing.
Oh, Adam, thank you so much. This was really fun. I love just where we went with the conversation, and that's why these are fun.
They are indeed. So for my listening audience, which we love you guys so much, it's such a great, big, beautiful community. There'll be lots of information in the show notes about Carla and her work and where to find her and access all the resources that are available. And we'd love to hear from you too. So if you've got some ideas around just what the show, where it went and questions you might have, or maybe there's some even feedback for us, we'd love to get that. AdamMarkel.com/podcast to leave a comment. And also if you've got friends, colleagues, family members that might benefit from some of the things that Carla shared, feel free to share this episode with those folks as well. We appreciate that greatly. For now, anyway, I will just say ciao. Well, I hope you were as just impressed with Dr. Fowler's ideas and her way of communicating as I was. She is remarkable, and we had so much in common. So just from a personal standpoint, I really vibed with that conversation. I loved how many sort of synergies there were, and there were more synergies than even we got to discuss today. But one of them being the fact that she is a digital nomad, and has been doing that for now, gosh, she said 4 years or so. And my wife and I, we've just recently, we didn't give up our home or anything, but we just decided that we were in a position to take it on the road, take the show on the road, if you will, and experience what it would be like, with kids out of the house now, and us having done that job as parents, this being more of a time when we could be intentional about how we want to experience our relationship and our relationship with each other, our relationship with work, our relationship in proximity to other people, and geographically speaking, where it is that we live, reside, play, work, etc. So Carla and I and her husband and my beloved, we have that in common. Really, really cool. And we also have in common our sort of love and passion for helping leaders and organizations and teams actually perform better and looking at it in a holistic way. We would say mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, and I think Carla gave us a different framework, but for specific areas, nonetheless, that she summarizes quite well. And we got to get into the weeds about today as well. So I love that conversation. I thought there was so much to be gained from really thinking at a deeper level about what Carla was sharing. And I added a few questions in there, including the one that I'm going to repeat right now, which is, what are you holding too tightly to? Is there something that you're holding too tightly? And if so, what is that? And where is it that you are potentially using willpower as a go-to, as a tool over and over and over again? Where is it potentially the case that tool, which in Carla's analogy she called a hammer, but where is it that you're using that willpower tool perhaps to the exclusion of other tools, or by reason of it being a default, that potentially you're actually wearing yourself thinner and maybe creating even more anxiety or more burnout or more exhaustion because there are other tools that are not being utilized, possibly because you identify with that tool, whether it's the willpower tool or it's the grit tool or it's the taking on everything tool, the I'm responsible tool, I'm a not a quitter tool, I'm a yes person, the person who doesn't say no to things and doesn't create boundaries or have sort of those carve outs to other people's expectations or other people's agendas. Lots and lots to consider there when it comes to how it is that you will develop greater performance in your world, be able to elevate your performance. I know that's what you want to do. I know it's what I want to do. It's what we all want to do. But also how it is that you lead others and help them to perform better, potentially not by perpetuating that cycle of just trying to will your way through it or grit your way through it or muscle your way through it more than is needed and maybe more than is optimal. So anyway, lots that we got to noodle on today. We'd love to get your thoughts on the show as always. If you could leave a rating on the platform that you consume the podcast as well. 5 stars is always great. That's helping us, or helping the algorithm to help us, and that for that we are grateful, incredibly grateful. But whatever rating, whatever feedback you have is valuable, and to take those few moments to do it, we so appreciate your time and your commitment to do that. So thank you, if you will. And if not, then we thank you as well for just being a part of the community, for listening, for sharing this episode if it's something valuable that you think other people could benefit from. We appreciate that too. For now anyway, I will just say ciao for now. Thank you again, and have a beautiful rest of your day.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope you now have even more tools and greater insights to build resilience and become change-proof. Help us inspire others by sharing this episode and leaving your comments over at adammarkel.com/podcast. For more resilience tips and strategies, including support for building change-proof teams, visit adammarkel.com/become change-proof.